All right, in this lesson, we are going to talk about something called absolute value. In our last lesson, we talked about integers and opposites, and now we're going to talk about something called absolute value. So again, our essential questions are, what is absolute value and how is it written in math? And can I evaluate expressions that contain absolute values? So let's get into this. What is absolute value? Now here's our definition. Absolute value is a number's distance from zero on the number line. So it's a very, very basic thing. It's a number's distance from zero. Now, when we think about distance, what kinds of numbers do we use to describe how far away something is? Okay, now think about if I asked you, how far away from school do you live? Or how far away is Milford from Spencer? Or how far away did you go on vacation this year? We're not going to use a negative number to describe that, are we? Nobody says, well, it's negative 10 miles to Milford, or I live negative 3 blocks away from school. So when we talk about a number's distance from zero, we're always going to refer to it in a positive sense. So if we look at the examples here I have on the screen, it asks how far is each number from zero. So I have 5 graphed on the number line. So if you look at how far away is 5 from zero, well, 5 is 5 units from zero, or 5 spaces from zero. So we say that the absolute value of 5 is 5 because it's 5 units from zero. So the next one, here's negative 9 on our number line, negative 9 right here. How far away from zero is negative 9? Now we wouldn't say it's negative 9 units away because again we're talking about distance. So we say that the absolute value of negative 9 is 9 because it's 9 units from zero. So really all we're doing is making the value positive because we're talking about how far away something is from zero. And then lastly here, just to make this clear, zero, how far is zero from zero? Well, 0 is 0 units from 0. So the absolute value of 0 is 0. So again, absolute value, we're talking about distance here. We're talking about how far away from 0 something is. So the next question we have is, how is absolute value written in math? How do you write absolute value? You know, we have signs that show plus signs. We've got greater than signs. We've got less than signs. We've got subtraction, multiplication. We've got all kinds of symbols that show things. How do you show absolute value in math? Well, we use something called absolute value bars. So it's these vertical lines here around the number, and that is how in math we show that we're asking for the absolute value of a number. So you would read this, if you saw this in math, you would read it, the absolute value of negative 7. So it's asking how far away from 0 is negative 7. That's what those vertical bars mean. How far away from 0 is negative 7. So to answer that, I've got negative 7 graphed right here on the number line. So how far away from 0 is negative 7? It is 7 units away from 0. So we would say right here, here's the complete statement. The absolute value of negative 7 is 7. So that's how we would read that mathematically. It's written much shorter using those absolute value bars. Also, make sure that when you draw absolute value bars, you make them nice and tall so they don't look like this. So I don't want to make them real short like that because that looks like 1 minus 71. So we don't want to mistake that for ones. So we want to make those absolute value bars nice and tall whenever we draw them in math, okay? So here we're going to graph each number on the number line and then find its absolute value. So here I have negative 10, which is right here on the number line. And how far away from 0 is negative 10? So here's 0, and negative 10 is 10 units away from 0. So we say the absolute value of negative 10 is 10 because it is 10 units from 0. Next one is 4. 4 is right here on our number line, and here is 0. So how far is 4 from 0? 4 is 4 units from 0. So we say the absolute value of 4 is 4. Now don't confuse this with opposites, because a lot of students will say the absolute value of 4 is negative 4. Well, that's not true, because those are opposites, not absolute value. So try to keep those concepts straight in your mind and in your notes. And then the last one, we have negative 6. Negative 6 is right here on the number line, and here is 0 again. How far away from 0 is negative 6? Well, negative 6 is 6 units from 0, so we would say the absolute value of negative 6 is 6. So again, very basic concept. Just be careful not to confuse it with opposites. So on the next screen here, we've got some expressions that contain those absolute value bars, and we have to be able to evaluate or find the value of these expressions when we have absolute value bars in our expressions. So we have here, this is red, the absolute value of negative 12. Well, how far is negative 12 from 0? Negative 12 is 12 units from 0, so we would say the absolute value of negative 12 is 12. Next one, we have the absolute value of 24. And again, 24 is 24 units from 0, so the absolute value of 24 is 24. And then the next one, the absolute value of 0, we've seen this before. 0 is 0 units from 0, so the absolute value of 0 is 0. Now the next column, they get a little bit more complex. So here we have a subtraction problem inside the absolute value bars. So how do we do this? Well, we treat it kind of like parentheses. So we have to do what's inside the absolute value bars first. And 10 minus 5 is 5. And we still have those absolute value bars around that. So the absolute value of 5 is 5. Next one, here we have the absolute value bars just around the negative 5, not around the plus 7. So again, we have to do this to figure out what that value is. What is the absolute value of negative 5? It's 5. So now we have 5 plus 7, which is 12. And then the last one, again, now we've got absolute value bars around both numbers. So we have to do the absolute values first before we can do the subtraction. So we have the absolute value of 23 is 23 minus the absolute value of negative 6. Well, how far is negative 6 from 0? 6 units. So this really turns into just 23 minus 6, which is 17. So that's how you can evaluate expressions that contain absolute values. And then lastly, we would just want to be able to compare numbers that contain absolute value bars as well. So the first one, we have the absolute value of negative 45 compared to 44. So what is the absolute value of negative 45? That's going to be 45, and 45 is greater than 44. Next one, the absolute value of negative 5 and 4. How are we going to compare these? Well, the absolute value of negative 5 is 5, and 5 is greater than 4. Next one, the absolute value of negative 11 and the absolute value of positive 11. Well, these both have an absolute value of 11, so these are actually equal to each other. The absolute value of negative 11 is equal to the absolute value of 11 because they're both the same distance from 0. So their distances are equal and they are opposites. Last one, the absolute value of negative 12 and the absolute value of negative 13. Well, the absolute value of negative 12 is positive 12, and the absolute value of negative 13 is 13, and 12 is less than 13. So we can make those comparisons as long as we know how to evaluate expressions that contain absolute values. So again, recap of our essential questions. What is absolute value? It's a number's distance from 0. How is it written in math? We use the absolute value bars. And then can you evaluate these expressions and then evaluate and use those values to make comparisons?